Hello everyone, today we talk about the widely traveled and powerful Boii, prominent Celtic people during the Indo-European expansion of the 4th and 3rd century BC. Numerous locations bear the name of the Boii, with Bononia in Moesia and Italy exemplifying the extent of their spread geographically throughout Europe. To the south of their sphere of influence, the Scordisci were dominant, looking at the neighbors, while to the west, the Taurisci held sway. The Boii, that we derive from the Latin plural, singular boius, thus in ancient Hellenic boioi, were a Celtic people of the later Iron Age, essentially attested at various times. So in this broader area, you have Cisalpine Gaul, present-day northern Italy. Look at the chronology of how we know history deals first with the Cisalpine settlement because it was closer to civilization. But of course, archaeology gives us a lot about the originary places of the people. We see them in Pannonia, so now present-day Austria and Hungary, parts of present-day Bavaria. Bavaria is yet another country that bears the name of the Boii historically for reasons that actually are not parallel to the Boii's existence, because if anything, it derives from Bohemia. That, of course, is the very present-day still historical region that takes most famously the name after the Boii. And since during the migration era, some of the Celto-Germanic tribes that moved on the Roman right bank of the Danube brought there the name of the Boii themselves, and hence were called Bajuvari. This was, however, we'll see we should make a video about the Bavarians, probably the old Bavaria as a people during the migration era, because their history is quite fascinating. As you know, Bohemia is also named as such, like translated in most languages bearing the Boii's name, and it comprises the bulk of today's Czech Republic. It was later settled by the Slavs. The Boiis stretch also over parts of present-day Slovakia and Poland, as well as what was the Gallia Narbonensis, so modern Languedoc and Provence in part. Additionally, archaeological evidence indicates that in the 2nd century BC, the Celts expanded from Bohemia to the Kłodzko Valley in Silesia, which is now part of Poland and the Czech Republic. Right? The Polish, the Ukrainian Celts are a bit forgotten in history, but also the Romanian ones. We will talk about them surely in other episodes similar to these. The problem with them is that they didn't have much of a strong, say, national, meant in the Latin sense, cohesion. So while we can't look at the Boii, even though they were scattered actually in different parts of Europe, as we will see now as a sort of single matrix, other peoples further east did not have necessarily the same press. We talk about the Scordisci, for example. The Danubian Celts are also pretty underrated, as they were also pretty advanced, telling the truth, contributed also to the development of the same Central and even Northern European peoples of the times of the Celts and the Germans as well. Look at the Gundestrup cauldron that is thought to have possibly been made in the Middle Danube, and the Boii were quite connected with these guys. They were, in fact, the ones from Bohemia would gradually descend to occupy, before the Roman expansion, very important strongholds. As a matter of fact, the most important ones at the time on the entire Danube. So, recapitulating, the primary territory occupied by the northeastern Boii encompassed not only Bohemia, but also much of modern Moravia, northeastern Austria, western Slovakia, and western Hungary, following exactly the Danubian river course. The Boii, however, as we were pointing out before, first appear in history in connection with the Gallic invasion of northern Italy in 390 BC. All right, the major invasion that, of course, it happens in a time that the same historiographers knew relatively a few of, but that is consistent with the archaeological evidence that we have, as well as the other historical one. At this point, the Boii settled together with the other peoples in the Po Valley. The Boii, in particular, south of the St. Po River, in the area of Mutina and the one of Felsina, right? That was, as you know, an Etruscan city where the Boii essentially established their, at least, main centers, because it already was, renaming it, in fact, Bologna, in their honor. That's how the modern city in Italy stems from. And we will talk about Bologna, as a matter of fact, in probably soon in the series about the historical regional series, and that in the case of Italy is dedicated to the communes for medieval history. So in other words, the Boii settled on the right bank of the Po River in the Po Valley, going down towards essentially the Apennine line that curves at that point, that is somewhat northwest, southeast as an axis, and then bends down more towards the south. The southernmost Celts there, however, reaching up to central Italy in settlement, were famously the Senones, the same one of Brennus, that we have also seen in other videos. Between the 8th and the 5th centuries BC, Bohemia, what came to be known as such, the Boiaenum, after the very Boii, was part of the broader Hallstatt culture area. So we're talking about essentially the Celts of this beginning of the Iron Age. Evidence of characteristic burial practices, such as wagon graves, has been found in Bohemia, along with other typical artifacts of the Hallstatt culture. Because these communities were preliterate, of course it is impossible to definitively ascertain whether the inhabitants of the late Hallstatt Bohemia fully spoke a Celtic language. Nevertheless, the strong cultural connections documented in the archaeological record at least make it reasonable to view them as parts of a large cultural continuum where Celtic speech was recorded in the following centuries because of the continuous waves of Gallic expansion in the area. Right. Naturally, archaeology is always limited to the extent that the various evidence does not bring a tag with it. If anything, it's you who has to give it to them, and given that the main information remains in the absence of any other, say, explicit definition, historiography, that's how we know pretty much certainly that what we're talking about in this case. From the various names of the same Celtic people found in literature and inscriptions, it is possible to abstract a continental Celtic segment, Boio. Right? Etymologically speaking, there are two major derivations of this segment, both of which presuppose its belonging to the, of course, Indo-European language family, one deriving from cow and the other from warrior. Thus, the Boii could be understood either as the herding people or the warrior people, which actually could overlap in the measure in which, of course, like the primary activity of these populations was war as a mean of expansion for the control of pastors, bringing in their cattle with them, and therefore breeding themselves like this new stock of heroes that were strongly connected with their sort of more material backbone, their nourishment, and more. The derivation from cow is primarily based on the Old Irish legal term for outsider, ambue, which comes from Proto-Celtic ambuios, that is ambuios, which means, so that you have the privative alpha in Greek, not a cattle owner. And so the sense is that these people were fundamentally not the zippe, so to speak in a Germanic sense, but a comitatus. So it's a bit like the same etymology of Gaul, which means foreigner, and that basically is referred to an entire people that eventually, of course, refer to it like for themselves, because the original population that had come to rule over these lands was fundamentally people in arms that had often devoted itself, sometimes even as a wall, but surely in the interest of the various war bands, brotherhoods of fighters that had lost their individual identity in favor of being an extension of God, and that would eventually settle down, having crushed their foes in battle, having seized their women, and only then becoming farmers, right, cattle breeders, etc. And it's interesting, of course, that there is this old Irish parallelism. There is all, as you know, a linguistical issue considering especially the idea of a broader set of beliefs pertaining to the Celtic world, especially as far as the deities go. But it's obvious that here we're talking about the same Celtic, at most Proto-Celtic, and definitely Indo-European base. It was also very common linguistically to the vocabulary, basically all the neighboring peoples. So we're just looking at different waves, peoples that came at different times, but sort of from the same spring, and sort of also blending with one another, naturally in the broader area, like installing themselves amidst some pre-existing populations that often were majoritarian. In reference to the first known historical Boii, Polybius notes that their wealth consisted of cattle and gold, that they relied on both agriculture and warfare, and this is exactly the same. Like cattle, it goes with agriculture to an extent, this sedentarization from this semi-nomadic lifestyle was happening. That gold, of course, was central to the religious belief that the material of the gods, and that was looted and treasured from the raids, from the spoils of war. Polybius says that among the Boii, a man's status was determined by the number of associates and assistants he had, and basically this goes in parallel with many other beautiful passages of classic literature on the ideal of the Gallic, of the Celtic warrior that is lording over some servants, right? He seeds and collects his harvest on the tip of his spear, because obviously somebody else is working for him, right? In the traditional Indo-European belief, the hero, the warrior, does not work, right? Only slaves work, but he has, of course, the God-given imperium to lord over other people. This is also for those who think that, the individual guy simply free out there, not bothering anyone, being the actual monk. No, these peoples had a very strong imperial Catholic understanding of what a man had to be, heavenly speaking. These associates were, that Polybius talks about, were presumably the same ambuio in contrast to the men of status, right? So the ones who did not own that cattle, as we've seen, privative A, and the boys without cattle. In fact, boius being in the sense, the cattle owner, in the sense that, as we've seen, he wouldn't work materially in that sense, but would control those who work for him in order to manage his conquered property. Consequently, the Boii originally represented the class identified as the cattle owners that also moved across Europe with such, in fact, mobile asset. The derivation of warrior, was scholarly derived from the Indo-European roots bei and bi, meaning to hit. However, upon not finding any Celtic names that closely match such etymology that would have conceptually been common, right, being deriving from such sort of universal concept, but with the exception of the Boii, there were some attempts to draw on examples that are somehow more distant, tracing back to early original forms. For example, the Venetic personal name Phoios, the Illyrian tribe Boioi, and the Hellenic tribal name Boiotoi, right, referring to the literal Boeotians of Boeotia, Greece, and a few others as well, which of course pertain to the broader Indo-European, matrix. And of course, we know too few, unfortunately, because of the literacy of these peoples. But it's a possibility. Similar broader connections can be hypothesized for the derivation related to cow. For example, the aforementioned Boeotians have long been recognized as people associated with cattle, a bit more, a bit wilder for, say, Attican or Peloponnesian tastes. Paralleling, by the way, the notion of Italy in relation, in this case, with the Boii that settled in Cisalpine Gaul as the land of calves. Remember that Italy may derive exactly from Vitellius. We do not know exactly whether that's the terminology, but this was a place that was rich in cattle. That's the origin of the country's name. Now, Indo-European reconstructions can be formulating using gu, meaning cow, as a basis, such as govie, and this root may itself be an imitation of the sound made by a cow, onomatopoeically. Contemporary derived terms include Boiorix, that we will see later, meaning king of the Boii. It was actually a chieftain of the Cimbri, and so here we have to understand, besides the in fact ethnographic categorization, what is a Celt, what is a German, because especially in that central northern European reality, it's just again about these waves and how certain pools of communities differentiate each other on the basis of wealth, of language. But again, the Indo-European matrix is pretty much the same. We have Boiodurum as a toponym signifying gate/fort of the Boii. That corresponds to the modern Passau in Germany, located at the confluence of the rivers Inn and Danube. We talked about Passau, incidentally, in some videos about, especially the 1683 siege of Vienna. That's where, for example, the Habsburg court took refuge in, where Prince Eugen was coming from France to reach Vienna. But remember that was an excellent position for a Celtic oppidum, like, as you know, the suffix dunum tells us. It's a bit like, the same Latin unum termination. Now, the memory of the Boii is preserved in the modern original names of Bohemia, as we know, as Boioheimum, which is a mixed language from derived Boii and the Proto-Germanic Heimat, meaning home, right? Like Heimat, like the fatherland. And this is significant because the Boii, as we will see now, will actually be overrun by the Germans, which caused a massive collapse of the otherwise quite sort of, especially commercially advanced community. Celtic community existed there, importing precious metals from as far as the Iberian Peninsula, minting their own coin there. Well, the Germans arrived and caused a major collapse, which, by the way, should always be remembered when people, presume that there was some sort of broader Celto-Germanic, infused hatred and conquered regarding stemming Rome or whatever. The Celts remained under Rome for half of a millennium, but the Germans were from the other side, and the encounter between the two peoples was not a peaceful one at all, as we'll see now. For example, the Cimbrian migrations, ended up against the Boii, even though right? There was a great proximity. Even we just remembered before how Boiorix was the leader of the Cimbri in that case, and surely we're talking about Celto-Germanic populations in many ways, especially the Boii of Bohemia living literally next door to the Germans, so a bit like the Belgae, having something there of the other side. And again, also drawing a line in between, does it make so much sense? In a sense, yes. As we've seen, the Germans were more primitive and brutal. The Celts of Bohemia a bit more sophisticated and gentrified, but then got the worst of it, which is also a lesson to be learned. Additionally, the name Bayern or Bavaria comes, as we were saying before, from the Germanic Bajovari, from the Germanic Bajavarias. The first component is most plausibly interpreted as a Germanic version of Boii, Baia, while the second one serves as a very common, as you know, morphological element in Germanic tribal names. It simply means dwellers, similar to the Old English suffix var. Therefore, the combination Boii dwellers may have signified those who inhabit the area where the Boii once resided, which fits pretty well, for example, the Marcomanni later on, that established, by the way, a powerful dominion. As you know, the challenged Rome was actually more, by the time of the Teutoburg force, actually the most challenging of the Germanic powers. That's the reason why the Romans sort of underestimated the West Germans that they had subjugated and thought of to be, after all, meek and that just to be Romanized for good. Now, according to ancient authors, the Boii arrived in northern Italy by crossing the Alps. This is the first notion that we have historiographically of these people. Alongside them, other tribes such as famously the Senones we were remembering before, but also the Lingones, the Canomani, that all had, in fact, some groups in this specific case remaining, some part of them remaining in Gaul, in fact living on as distinct peoples there, is very typical of many Celtic peoples, are also documented, in fact, in Gaul at the time of the Roman conquest. It's fascinating, of course, to observe how they would retain their tribal identity even in such distant parts of Europe, not just because the Celts had a broad trade network and sort of they maintained, of course, intense relations between Central Europe, the Mediterranean, and even beyond, but because, of course, there was a political and military principle behind their cohesion that would make them, especially in the early age, like quite tough, the prototype of the barbarian of Central European warrior, if you want, even the Nordic one from a Mediterranean perspective, par excellence, right? And we'll talk more about the Celtic invasions and migrations in another video, but as you know, I made a lot of content about Gallic and Celtic warfare in general. We talked about the Britons as well, and I'm planning to even start a series about the Romano-Brittonic wars, at least the Roman conquest. I also have some properly late Romano-Brittonic warfare video incoming. That's another story. Because of the aforementioned list of properly Gallic peoples coming from Gaul, roughly today's France and Belgium, peoples in the great Celtic invasion of northern Italy next to the Boii, there has been general question, is to say, where were the Boii originary of? Right? We know, of course, of Bohemia historically being the center of their major settlement among the various ones that were articulated across Europe. But the question is, where was that group of Celts of Bohemia originary of, in turn? And since the ones that we know first about historiographically are the Cisalpine ones at the beginning of the 4th century BC, and we don't have too many informations about, say, the political history of Central Europe at this point, some have wondered whether the Boii could be actually originary of the same Gaul, right? So this would have been a Celtic people that sort of spread from the same Central Europe to settle in Gaul, and from there to migrate, crossing the Alps into Italy. Some say that the Boii could have been originary of southern Germany, or of the same Bohemia. The point is, of course, determining when properly the political identity, the ethnonym, the cohesive group that we can distinguish as the Boii at the time, regardless of our information or not, had we lived there at the time, really came to exist. And unfortunately, this remains a mystery a bit. But speaking of their earliest known history, Strabo tells us that the Boii emigrated from their lands across the Alps and were one of the largest tribes among the Celts at the time, which sort of makes sense if you consider again the eventual distribution across Europe that they sort of embodied, even though this does not necessarily speak for an enormous, say, progressed cohesion. We do not know exactly. These systems were pretty unstable to a degree, and even if they bore the original name of the tribe, still they lived in conditions that sort of obliged them to move, and obviously not necessarily like quite positive ones. Had they wanted to move, had they had the entire cohesion to do so, they would have, say, established a major concentration of force, say, taking over the entire northern Italy. But this is not what Celts do at the time, because they do not really have that level of political, in fact, compactness. According to Livy, the Boii and the Ungones arrived in Italy via the Poenine Pass. Upon discovering that the territory between the Alps and the Po River was already occupied, which they would have known before migrating, these are a bit, in fact, the notions that historiography gives us. But, of course, there is a part of truth, because, yes, migrating was not easy. It was always a risky enterprise. Until you were there, you couldn't really tell what kind of resistance, for example, you would meet, what kind of other powers you would trigger the reaction of. However, the Boii decide to cross the Po River on rafts and to expel not only the Etruscans but also part of the Umbrians from the area. However, they did not venture south of the Apennines. They camped themselves on the Adriatic side of the watershed. Polybius notes that the Celts were close neighbors to the Etruscan civilization at this point and, quote, cast covetous eyes on their beautiful country, which sort of makes sense considering the prosperity of the Etruscans. We will talk about them. We made a video already on the Etruscan hoplite and so-called hoplite. Remember, there was never ever an hoplitic phalanx of any kind, trace or form in Italy. That's kind of the content I'm most proud of. A report by Cato indicates that the Boii in what had become Cisalpine Gaul now were distributed among 112 cantons. All right, those are the local clans. Judging by the artifacts discovered in the local tombs, the Boii must have reached a significant stage of civilization by their time of their migration in Italy. Both Polybius and Livy mentioned that the Boii expelled the Etruscans. As we were saying, it's possible that some Etruscans were indeed forced to leave. However, the archaeological evidence from Bologna and its surrounding areas suggests that the Boii integrated into the population through intermarriage, and that if anything, it would have been the Etruscan elites that would have been ousted, whereas, as we pointed out before, just by from the same Boii ethnonym, the Celts would have been lording over these conquered peoples, as originally like this pretty compact-bodied warriors. The cemeteries from this period in Bologna contain Latin weapons and other artifacts, indeed connected with the Celtic migration, alongside Etruscan items, though, such as bronze mirrors, which also points at some femininity. Of course, like partly like the same Boii women would have adopted the local fashions, but we have, for example, a more interesting explanations, such as in the case of Monte Bibele, that is in Pianoro in Emilia-Romagna, not far away from Bologna, one grave containing Latin weapons and a pot inscribed with an Etruscan female name, right? Which means, of course, that many Boii would have married into the local Etruscan women. The burial rites of the Italian Boii show many similarities with the contemporary ones of Bohemia, by the way, such as inhumation, which was uncommon with the other Cisalpine Gauls, or the absence of the typically Western Celtic torques. This is fascinating in general. Of course, it's not like they didn't have them or they didn't cremate, etc. In absolute terms, but of course there was a different degree of depending on the origin of the people. And as we were saying before, the same Bohemia had sort of been invested by the Celts, but just like, I don't know, here northern Italy was, but of course there were other peoples also north of the Alps, which we know relatively few. However, this information is mostly useful to point at the fact that likely this Cisalpine group had contacts with Bohemia, and so likely at least a substantial part of them came from there, not just from surely other groups, other war bands coming a bit from everywhere. The Celtic migration of the beginning of the 4th century is also by the sources described into much sort of a unitary movement, but we know there were waves of this phenomenon, that the same groups entering Italy were relatively scattered. And the same fact that tradition reports, of course, as sort of was reflected by the later political separation, all these various tribes that were not acting as one in northern Italy only, imagine just in Transalpine Europe as a whole, is quite telling. Of course, there would have been Boii going at war with Turks. It was pretty universal. In many ways, we sort of underestimated how such practices that, as you know, in this case, were specifically connected to the aforementioned possession from the kind of the divinity from those warbanders devoted to it, fighting to the death as a consequence, are pretty common also among other peoples. Not necessarily use the torque as we know it, but even peoples that would reacquire them. I made a video about the Roman torque, for example, is among the decorations during the Republic, stemming exactly from having killed a lot of Gauls, and being something important in the Roman sagas. This did not belong. Say there were other ways that had sort of been more modern, secular, doing that, but they still existed. The Romans had bracelets of sort. It wasn't just like a sort of Celtic or Iranian thing, right? Those came more directly from the spring of this Celtic practice, and so they were more primitively, say, genuine, but then closer, probably the deeper meaning of it. But this would have been very well known by lots of peoples out there. The Boii was settled in Italy, engaged in numerous wars with the Romans. It is unclear whether the Boii participated, for example, in the Senones incursion into central Italy in 284 BC. Surely, again, also in previous times, say at Brennus I, there would have been some Boian warrior in Brennus' ranks. We made a video about the Allia river battle. There is, of course, like especially the war bands were traveling far and wide. There was a much greater movement than the one we sort of tend to imagine. They weren't just settled peoples, but still a bit like with the Germans later, like these warbanders that made it their point of existence just to roam the world in search for glory. And we know how many Celts were hired in the Hellenistic War by the Carthaginians, etc. And the same Romans, by the way, later as auxiliaries and so on. We'll have to talk about that specifically too, because the Celts did contribute largely, of course, as the main ethnic group, like covering this enormous swaths of Europe and beyond. Think about the Galatians in Anatolia. In any case, the Romans in 284 against the Senones would launch a counterattack and defeat them shortly afterward. In 283 BC, that's why we say this, that the Boii descended into battle to avenge the Senones, right? That lived again south of their territory, like in northern central Italy, and forming, in this case, an alliance with the Etruscans that at this point were sort of done for, especially after Centenum. But just like these Celts that were, as we've seen originally, their enemies, having stripped them of their Po Valley possession, trying to escape the Roman conquest. And during the Battle of Lake Vadimone, located near the Tiber River and 65 kilometers north of Rome, that's how close the Boii arrived, at least as a singular political force. They were, however, annihilated by the Romans under the command of Publicius Cornelius Dolabella, who had already defeated the Etruscan reinforcement that had come to the Boii's aid. The following year, we are in 282, the Boii faced another defeat at the hands of the consul Quintius Aemilius Papus, leading them to request and obtain peace. The conflict reignited in 238, although there were no significant successes for the Romans at that time, and again in the years 237-236 BC. During this period, fierce discord erupted within the ranks of the Boii themselves, who had gathered against the Latin colony of Ariminum, Rimini, on the Adriatic Sea, that sort of symbolized the affirmation of Rome and the lands that had previously belonged to the Senones. Speak about Sena Gallica, that takes the name, in fact, from those Celts. I made a video about the Roman conquest of Italy in general. We still have to, of course, go in depth regarding such wars and campaigns. We have to make more of them, admittedly, but also looking at this through the lens of the Boii in this case, because it's just, this is basically all the information we have. Like, yes, there is a bit more, but the essence gets down to this. For example, in 225, there is the famed Battle of Telamon, right? This had occurred because the Insubres, the Lingones, the Taurini, and the Transalpine Gaesatai. So the Taurini lived in northwestern Italy. We've seen them talking about the Ligurians, the video about the latter's historical units. The Gaesatai were essentially some of these war banders. Took the name from their heavy javelin spears, and were renowned warriors, right? Specific units. In fact, all the Celts sort of fought mostly primarily with spears, but here were sort of sacred war bands, again, particularly devoted, as the Comitatus, as the Fiannas, for example, in later literature. To that enterprise. I will talk more about Gallic Celtic weapons. I made multiple videos about them, but if you look especially at the one about the Allia River, you get the essentials of how Gallic spears and weapons in general were evolving at this time. And you know that there is a general decline of Celtic military quality after the first invasions and the settlements. even though these were tough warriors indeed. And in 225, after an initial success against the Romans at Clusium, the Gauls suffered a devastating defeat at Cape Telamon. One of the victors, the consul Lucius Aemilius Papus, then penetrated for the first time into the heart of the Boii territory, breaking a bulk on their lands. The Battle of Telamon is quite important, fascinating, shows how powerful this, say, coalition of Celtic tribes really was. The host was impressive. The Romans, however, had by now almost fully matured their manipular legion, and they really made great display of that. In 224, the Roman consuls invaded Boii territory again, forcing the Boii to make peace by ceding a portion of their land as well. Here we are before the Second Punic War, and so Rome hasn't quite conquered Cisalpine Gaul, but has basically starting to extend its direct control on parts of the same. She is really hegemonic as a whole. So what happens with the Annibalic War is really a coming back of Celtic power fueled by the same Carthaginians that were making leverage on the Celtic hatred towards Rome. And this is the reason why right before Hannibal's arrival in the peninsula, the Boii formed an alliance with the other Cisalpine Gauls and the Etruscans against Rome, which had established, by the way, the colonies of Cremona and Placentia in their Gallic territory. They're already, as we were saying before, establishing these centers of Romano-Italic people and soldiers, especially the Roman citizens were settled in these frontier areas in exchange probably for military service. I mean, just their presence there was enough for them to be constantly militating and not having to participate to the general levy of the army, the consular forces. By this time, the Boii remained a formidable force after all, but Hannibal and Asdrubal viewed the Celts as useful yet expendable cannon fodder rather than as elite soldiers. As you know, in the Carthaginian army during the Annibalic War, the Celts were used with great proficiency, but weren't exactly ranked among the finest troops to begin with, and this is the usual issue with the fact that, yes, being a warrior culture definitely, from an individual point of view, means a lot of things in fighting capacities, but say, collectively doesn't mean that you are this radical for that's just being a tribal people in general. Is not a hallmark of military quality to begin with, especially compared to forces like the Roman or the Carthaginian ones. Now, leveraging their environment, which included woods and swamps, however, and this is also what, say, speaking of the strategic divide, the Boii managed to hold the advance of a Roman army in 218. They defeated another in 216, during which they killed the general Lucius Postumius Albinus. And there is this horrifying anecdote about the fact that the Roman general's head was severed, cleaned, gilded, and repurposed as a sacrificial cult vessel. Livy tells us that. The Celts did that, as actually also the Romans were fond with decapitations and all, just they had, again, gradually sort of more modernized, secularized regarding the original meanings, but they would maintain that throughout their entire history. The reason why the Celts did so was not much just, an idea of course, of punishment of a vanquished enemy, but of course also a compliment regarding the fact of using the head of a chieftain, so the one through which passed the same imperium, to be used for their own, in fact, medium, like their own baculation of the same in their sanctuaries, and as an offer to the same god, by the way, as a pretty valuable carrier. Now, in 201 BC, the Boii overcame a disorganized Roman force that was ravaging their crops. This is still Livy 31:2 if you need the references, but these are famous passages to find. However, the same Boii faced defeat at Placentia in 194 and Mutina in the following year. Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica, cousin of the Africanus, completed the Roman conquest of the Boii in Cisalpine Gaul in 191 BC, celebrating a triumph for his achievement. Rome at this point was coming back. The Second Punic War is over. There had been some Carthaginians remaining in the north among the Celts, trying to, also independently from Carthage, trying to gain something out of it. But Rome now was not just, let's say, continuing her expansion, but now to punish the Gauls that had sided with the Carthaginians. This is the reason why, following their losses, also a significant portion of the Boii, according to Strabo, departed from Italy. The Boii still, in the last efforts to safeguard the Cisalpine dominion, demonstrated remarkable resilience. In 193, we know of a major force that they had fielded, and that we know from the losses, right? 14,000 dead, with 1092 captured alive, alongside 221 horses, which is also pretty neat segmentation. Gives you an idea of how much cavalry existed, say, in proportion in the Celtic armies. 3 chieftains, approximately 212 standards, and 63 wagons. This is what Livy tells us. And because of the aforementioned reason, the Celts were not treated with honorable terms by the Romans upon surrender. At best, they were sold into slavery. Notably, in 192, a Boii chieftain approached Consul Titus Quinctius Flaminius and surrendered himself, his wife, and his family. Flaminius had the chieftain and his family ritually slaughtered, allegedly to entertain his lover, which was, however, just an anecdote from later historiography. We do not know. A few years later, in 189 BC, a Latin colony was established in Felsina, which the Romans too named after the Boii as Bononia. Having migrated to Italy from north of the Alps, some of the defeated Celts, as we were saying before, simply moved back to their kinsfolk into Transalpine Europe. We've seen it being sort of typical of some Celts. We've seen this Gordiski. This was not much like the case for the Gauls of Gaul, right? But this, especially in the case of the Boii, the fact that there was still a Boian state north of the Alps, like of course it was, and also at this point a relatively florid one, especially considering its neighbors, was attractive for someone losing, by the way, their possessions so brutally. In the later early and middle Latin phases, the Boii become increasingly visible in the archaeological record. Similar forms of material culture extend from Bohemia across northeastern Austria, Moravia, and southwestern Slovakia to the Hungarian plains, both southwest and north of the Danube. Poseidonius, via Strabo 722, mentions the Boii as residing in the Ursinian forest. Julius Caesar, in his Commentari de Bello Gallico 624, notes that the Volcae and the Tectosages were also settled in this region. These were essentially Celts living along the Danube. The term Ursinian forest, as you know, appears to have initially included western mountain ranges of Germany. It was immense, immensely wooded area. Its confines being conceptually as seemingly stretching up to the Sudete and Carpathian mountains, encompassing the same Bohemia. And so this is the reason why in 114, 113 BC, we're told that the Boii repelled the Cimbri that, as you know, had been migrating along with the Teutonists and the Ambrones, exactly in the Hercynian forest. So, mostly on the right side, let's say in the eastern, far east, say, of the Rhine, well into, in fact, Bohemia. And as you know, the Cimbri, originating from the region of Jutland, was traversing Europe in search of new lands to the south. They had to cross most of these Celtic ones. They made a pretty big mess in places like Noricum, so you'll see now. Also in the northern Iberian Peninsula, they set Gaul on fire, which also sort of showed how that enormous land mass was very heavily populated and agriculturally productive one was open, right, for further invasion. This was signal to the other Germans, but also to the Romans and pretty much everybody involved. That's how the Celtic world, as say prosperous as large, was, however, showing its internal weakness politically and militarily. So the Cimbrian movements were not random. They navigated through the Elbe Valley to avoid the Celtic hill forts along, say, the terrestrial route. They would be actually along the same Elbe. But what is fascinating is actually that, as we've seen in our videos about, for example, the Ottonian campaigns against the Slavs, more or less, especially against the same Bohemia later on, this route of invasion would be used from northern Germany, in fact, to reach those, say, upper Elbe possessions. As we said before, the leader of the Cimbri was named Boiorix, a name that is undeniably Celtic, and not only its meaning is well understood, it translates to King of the Boii. So the sense here is that there was either a Celto-Germanic say alliance of some sort. The Ambrones, for example, were thought to be Celts, Celto-Germanic, the same Cimbri as well, the Teutonists. As you know, in Central Europe, the real civilization, more advanced devil people, were actually the Celts, materially in terms of, say, wealth, trade, connections, and so on. They had more fortified places and so on. The Germans were angrier and more aggressive, more actually compact. It was a fresher force that was much more toughened up by, say, much greater instability and infighting, and that was now pushing to in search of new land, etc. So it's possible in all of this that the Boii had sort of struck the Germans for their wealth, for their power, and that there was an imitation of some sort of the same Boii, of Boiaenum, even as far as the title of, say, of this leaders really was. Like when you read Brenna's, Boiorix, Vercingetorix, Vercingetorix, as a matter of fact, these are not their actual names. These are political, say, titles / nicknames that they obtained because of their, we've just seen it in a recent video about probably the Germanic idea of leadership, in many ways pertaining to the Celts, especially the ones of the earlier age, in a very similar way, being connected with this temporary enterprise for which all the warriors would follow the greater leader that was thought to have this sort of magic imperial capacity. And the tribal name Cimbri bears a striking resemblance, by the way, to the Brittonic term Cintri, meaning companions or tribesmen, from which Cymru, for example, the Welsh name for Wales itself is derived. So the idea is that, first of all, again, these were very similar peoples to one another, right? More or less in Europe, say at least the Indo-European peoples were all sort of cousins with one another. I always remind how the Gallic declension is identical to the second Latin one. These people were really very similar. And so, and especially the Celts and the Germans of Central Europe at this time, for making us think that there was something similar happening in Boiaenum compared to many other groups. That is to say, the infiltration of Germanic warbands eventually would take over. This wouldn't happen at this point because, as you see, the Cimbri are actually repelled by the Boii, yet another indicator of the fact that this great unity of intents of the Celts and the Germans against the terrible Rome is actually a load of BS. Also, like, if you know what happened later, the Gauls accepted Romanity to a much larger degree than the Germans, for which the Romans were actually called into Gaul. And also, here in the, let's say, on both banks of the Danube, things were, to escalate in a pretty violent confrontation between the Celts and the Germans. However, at this point, we are in the 2nd century BC, there is still some force that the Celts have to spend. For example, the Boii would later launch an attack on the kingdom of Noricum, its capital Noreia. We're talking modern Austria fundamentally, which the Cimbri, the same Cimbri, had previously targeted in 120 BC, even before attacking the Boii specifically, which of course speaks of this broader push towards the south. The Noricans were thought to be good smiths, right? The Calibus Noricum was, pretty well balanced, say, carbonized iron that the Romans, as you know, would use for the weaponry. These were the greatest metallurgical center in Europe was there, with some exception, at least this in the broader Celtic world that, as you know, had advanced metallurgy, and just because it was a warlike people, except some parts of Spain, but that also were, in fact, influenced by the Celts that had partly settled there. But the point I was making is that the Boii themselves in Central Europe are still sort of thinking to move again. This is far as we've seen after, by the way, Rome has has subdued mostly the Boii in Cisalpine Gaul, and here the kingdom of Noricum was a Roman ally, right, that the Romans were defending. So they showed hostility towards Rome, even though they also repelled the Cimbri. That doesn't matter whether Germanic or Celto-Germanic, they did not like, because they were just outsiders who wanted to take them over. And actually, what finally happens to the Boii of the Arsinian force is that they found themselves in turn displaced from their territory by the Germanic Marcomanni, right? And this specifically pertains to the lands north of the Danube, because the Boii proper was that. Then the Boii were partly, as we'll see now, keep dwelling along the Danube, better fortified, more difficult to conquer Oppida. But it's, as we'll see now at this point, that many of them, having previously pushed eastward, as we've seen into Austria and Pannonia, were ultimately to encounter disastrous circumstances with the Dacians. In fact, in 60 or 59 BC, the famous Dacian king Burebista initiated a policy of westward expansion, first targeting the Skordiski. I made a video on them. I also talk about Dacian warfare to an extent. And then the Boii and the Tauriski. According to Strabo, Burebista's objective was to reclaim ancient Dacian territory that had been previously occupied by the Dacians, and that the Celts had settled instead. This is not, this would have been the casus belli, but it would have not been a random one, right? Indeed, these peoples had sort of clashed against one another. The Celts had mostly followed like the course of the Danube, but they had settled up to, in fact, Singidunum with the Skordiski. Then some of them, after moving into Greece, they settled in Anatolia. That's actually in turn how the Skordiski, in part, like some came back north and settled essentially modern day Serbia to an extent. But the Dacians were a more compact people, especially in a political institutional way. They were sort of a kingdom. They had historically strong ties with the Macedonians. They had some very powerful elite and still sort of substantially warlike people. They had good armor. They were morally loaded. And so they were under this leader coalescing ever more in such unitary direction, were in the same Romans. As you know, Caesar would have liked to get the Illyricum and conquer Dacia with all its precious metal mines rather than gold, but eventually Roman political gains brought him to gold, so that's really how he was a politician led to war in many ways, and so excellently as well. But as far as the Boii concern us here, there was a severe defeat inflicted by the Dacians on the Boii. In fact, a group of them, numbering 32,000 according to Julius Caesar, left Bohemia and joined the Helvetii in their effort to settle in western Gaul. The Helvetii were yet another Celto-Germanic people, the strongest in Gaul after the Belgae, that, however, eventually the Romans aggressed because of this march to the west and finding a place to be in Gaul. And this is interesting because the Helvetii had allied themselves with the Boii, as we've seen, posing also in that context, because they bordered one another, threat to the same kingdom of Noricum, which Rome did not like at all as an alliance. And it is likely for this reason that Noricum also established a diplomatic connection with a Germanic tribe, or better, for how it had come to be now a confederacy, the Suebi in the north. And this is extremely important again to show that the Celts and the Germans were not really that friendly with one another at all. This Norico-Suebian alliance had occurred with, at least in this case, you have essentially Celtic people like the one of Noricum siding with the Suebi, but mostly to pair himself from this other Celts. And as we've seen, the Germans were pushing against the Celtic war in general. And there was a marriage. The sister of Vocio, the king of Noricum, to the same married to the same German leader Ariovistus. In this context, it becomes clear why Ariovistus was regarded at this time as a king and friend of Rome. It's very interesting to point out how Ariovistus himself is yet another title bestowed on a Germanic leader. The Suebi, there is no doubt on their origin, of Celtic origin, right? And this would come from Gaulish Arius, even though we understand that that's a common, in fact, Aryan term meaning noble. In fact, that's the meaning of the Indo-Europeans. And Wisu, that is knowledge perception. You understand that, yes, this is Proto-Celtic, but also Proto-Germanic, depending. Visus, let's say, or say at least if it may come from Harriot's, Frustats, Furistats, foremost, ruler, lord. There is some ambiguity because, again, we're not told openly, but it shows also in this case how the Germans, in spite of their greater military force, were still looking up to the Celts, at least in their sort of holier accomplishments, militarily speaking, in the previous era. By the way, speaking of the previous alliances, it's clear why the Helvetii now felt threatened from all sides. After the Helvetii were defeated by the Romans at Bibracte, the influential Aedui tribe permitted the surviving Boii to settle within their territory, where they would occupy the oppidum of Gorgobine. So you have the Boii leading, according to Caesar, with 32,000 men, tidily, like we can appreciate them for succeeding in this migration and landing more or less safely, in spite of this military reversals, finally in Gaul, where they actually wanted to go for a better living, right? And they were settled in Gorgobina. And in his fight against Caesar, Vercingetorix Rex would later retaliate against the Boii of Gorgobina because, in fact, these were dependent on the more powerful Aedui, who had in turn remained loyal to Rome, at least at this point. They were also defeated at Bibracte but they had historically been the greatest allies of Rome. And the Boii were depending on them also because they were a weak tribe, like just 30,000 men. I mean, not literal men, but as a whole group of Celts. At least, yes, Caesar says that these were the actual warriors, but the number is inflated, most likely mirrors like the part of the Boii that moved across Central Europe after their Dacian debacle. It's also interesting how, of course, the Romans had initially maintained this, say, alliance with the main powers out there. The Suebi, essentially today's northeastern Germany, part of Poland, the Aedui in the very center of Gaul, the richest, more advanced part. These peoples had magistrates, they had some sort of more cohesive. They were actually more softened up, more, say, actually weaker. They were powerful, actually, were a large tribe, but compared to the Germans and these Celto-Germanic peoples such as the Helvetii and the Belgae, they were despised and thought to be, in fact, effeminated because they had corrupted material culture and so on. Whereas the Belgae, the Helvetii, had been fighting more relentlessly with the Germans. They were, if anything, the stronger of the Gauls, because also the Celts, telling the truth, because they had just a greater national cohesion due to the Metus Hostilis. For the rest, they actually fought in a semi-identical way. There was nothing specifically structural about this or that force. But that's what makes the difference, Clausewitzionally speaking. Although, as we've seen, Vercingetorix Rex attacked the Boii at one stage of the war, they would still support him with 2,000 troops during the Battle of Alesia. Caesar tells us this in the Bello Gallic of 775. In fact, at this point, many Gauls had woken up to the fact that, of course, Rome was there not just to save them from the Germans, but, of course, to stay for good, ruling over them. And so the Boii thought to again, there had been, as you've seen, a lot of side change before, provide this force to the Arvernian leader. Now, other sections of the Central European Boii remain closer instead to their traditional homeland, at least in region, and settled, in fact, in the Slovak and Hungarian lowlands by the Danube and the Mura rivers, with a central location at Bratislava, today's capital of Slovakia. It was, in fact, a very important oppidum. The main centers were Aquincum, Vindobona, also later capitals, Carnuntum. So that was a very strategic place, and in fact, it's also where the Romans would install themselves as the most sort of militarized section of the Danube, on the basis of this very Celtic centers that had been, of course, also refounded by the Romans after the Conquest. After the Romans, in fact, ultimately conquered Pannonia in 8 AD, Pliny, in his Natural History 3:147, notes that what would have become the Hungarian plains southwest of the Danube were the Deserta Boiorum, so the Boian wastelands. And the reason why this was the case seems to have been the fact that they had been previously inhabited by the Boii, but that by the Dacian distractions, especially, and the Roman conquest later, there wasn't really anything much, at least, left of the Boii, and so of a also previously developed area, like a few remained, like just infrastructurally, and again, admittedly, these are not radically overly developed areas, like they're more like so opening towards the plains, right? So they are mostly areas of confrontation, as they literally became, but they seemed also very depopulated because of the defeat of the Boii by the Dacians that we observed before. However, the Boii were not exterminated. They existed, for example, we see it within the Roman Empire, Civitas Boiorum et Azzaliorum. This is another people, the Azzali were being a neighboring tribe, which fell under the jurisdiction of a prefect, a Roman prefect of the Danubian shore, the Praefectus Ripae Danubi. this civitas, so the standard Roman administrative term designating both a city and the surrounding first tribal, then now municipal district, was later annexed to the city of Carnuntum. Those are the areas, right? And under Augustus, the incorporation of a few surviving enclaves, such as the remaining Boii in Transdanubia, in the early 1st century AD, marks the end of Celtic liberty in continental Europe. This is important because, again, yes, there were other Celtic peoples, but as we said at the beginning, like they weren't particularly well placed. Now the Germans were really swarming across Central Europe in multiple directions, and these other populations, especially far sort of east and north, they didn't have many resources to begin with. So of course the Romans extend their control also across the Danube. They pacify what's out there. It's within their sphere of influence that they control it indirectly. Remember always that the Roman monumentum, along what we call the limes, was always to control not just those who were inside, so to protect them. In part, they were actually to deter, say, on the Rhine, the Gauls that had conquered and remained under Rome for half of a millennium, but also to control the peoples who were out there. So, again, we've seen also this area in the Middle Ages, like the corner between Bohemia, Moravia, Bavaria, Hungary. It would historically always be a frontier area, and actually have a video incoming on medieval Slovakia that will say what became Slovakia, that is aiming at looking at this, made videos about the so-called Great Moravian more. But there is definitely a continuity. Like many Boii remained in Bohemia, as many Boii remained in Cisalpine Gaul. They became Romans. In the later case, in the former, they became Germans, right? The Bavarians, as they came to be the duchy along, let's say, what is today's Bavaria, so on the right bank of the Danube. That was a Celtic land. Of course, it was made up of Germans, of Celts, of Romans, right? Gradually Germanized. There were also some Slavs and other elements, Iranians by that point in migration here, etc. But they were in many ways the descendants of those other people. Just like there were many Roman citizens and legionnaires in Caesar's army that invaded Gaul, that of course were of Celto-Italic ancestry, notoriously so, especially Cisalpine Gaul. By those times was really the major pool of Roman legionary recruitment. Right, it would be so strategically relevant. So there are just a couple of episodes of anecdotes. Plautus refers to the Boii in his Captivi. Comedy says, "At nunc siculus non est Boius est Boiam terret," which is again a word that sounds like, but now he's not a Sicilian, he's a Boius. And he has taken a Boia woman. And the actual joke here is that the term Boia means both woman of the boy in this case, but also the restrained color used on a convicted criminal. Actually, in modern Italian, Boia is the name of the carnifex, of the guy who takes out the sentence to death. And this actually is nice because also, how much do you hear the term Boius, Boian, or Boia for the female? Specifically, like, we always talk boy, even as an adjective normally. Unfortunately, say, in our broader vocabularies, historically, it hasn't stuck like as other populations. And so, such a way we would even define an adjective for them. But they were, as we've seen, a very important people. Now, in the volume 21 of his History of Rome, Livy asserts that it was a man from the Boii tribe who offered to guide Hannibal across the Alps. Meaningfully enough, he would know the place, even though he probably didn't live there. but especially he had, as we've seen, the political motivation against Rome to do so. And Livy writes, when after the action had thus occurred, his own men returned to each general, Scipio could adopt no fixed plan of proceeding, except that he should form his measures based on the plans and undertakings of the enemy. Hannibal, uncertain whether to continue his march into Italy or to engage with the Roman army that had first presented itself, was diverted from an immediate confrontation by the arrival of ambassadors from the Boii and a petty prince named Magallus. They declared their intention to be guides on his journey and companions in his perils. They advised that Italy should be attacked with the full strength of the war, stating that his force had not been previously diminished. Right? A later note that we could make, also numismatically, but that is a broader indicator that the end of the Boii in the Danubian area, in the 1st century BC. Remember that the Boianum was overwhelmed by the Germans already. There had already been an important commercial collapse, right? But we have, and this is celebrated, I think, also on the Slovakian currency, in remembrance, in fact, of these ancient times, high-quality minted coins known as biatex, because they featured this inscription, this leader, right? Likely the name of the local monarch, also in that standard way we were talking about before, and written in Latin letters, of course. This is coming from that time in which, if the Romans weren't there yet, they sort of had been culturally hegemonized, also because it's people's hope, of course, at that point to enter the Roman markets in some ways. And the oppidum of Manking, a ceramic object, was discovered bearing the label Boius or Baius, and that is displayed in the local museum that is dedicated to Celto-Roman history. We have the discontinuation of a distinct type of Hungarian Celtic coinage known as vellum type that is associated with the aforementioned Deserta Boiorum, and so the wasteland that the Dacians made of the Boian controlled today's Hungarian plains after Burebista's campaigns. As you understand, it's a very interesting history. I've been making quite a bit of these Celtic history peoples, especially. I began with the Germans, but then I decided, why don't you talk about the Celts, because we rarely, I think I haven't, yes, there's Celtic history, but they're all together, but there's ancient Celtic history as well. We made so far not too much, I mean, about specifically this Celtic peoples, but we talked about the Aedui already, we talked about the Skordiski, we talked about ancient Medellin. In Celtic, we talked about quite a bit of an interesting set of things. However, this is pretty much it for today. We'll surely continue, like Schwerpunkt, hopefully going on. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.